Hello, hello, hello. This is Dr. Christian Lehman, and it is December of 1849. That's right. We are on installment 8 of Charles Dickens's David Copperfield. Chapters 22, 23, and 24. Today, I'm going to go through quite a bit. We'll go over the chapter titles. I have a slide about David's memory process as we start to reflect a little bit more about his theories on memory. A brief passage that returns us to the treatment of the mentally ill. Then we'll look at Steerforth for a fair amount. I'll talk about some 19th century polar exploration, discuss possibilities of allusion. Then we return with a little bit more intensive study of disability studies with the figure of Miss Mowcher. Then we'll talk about fallen women and Urania, Cottage, and Martha. A little bit on writing drunkenness, because we have one of the great typographic moments in Dickens. Then empire and illustrations. So let's jump straight into it. Chapter 22 is one of the most influential chapters, especially after last week, where the first chapter's installment was, or 2 weeks ago, was not as full of important things. Like to make a judgment that call that way. I mean, really, you could argue any passage is the most important, but for the purposes of these lectures, this chapter 22 is key. For my own part, my occupation in my solitary pilgrimages was to recall every yard of the old road as I went along it, and to haunt the old spots of which I never tired. I haunted them as my memory had often done, and lingered among them as my younger thoughts had lingered when I was far away. The grave beneath the tree where both my parents lay, on which I had looked out when it was my father's only, with such curious feelings of compassion, and by which I had stood so desolate when it was opened to receive my pretty mother and her baby. The grave which Peggotty's own faithful care had ever since kept neat and made quite a garden of, I walked near by the hour. It lay a little off the churchyard path in a quiet corner, not so far removed, but I could read the names upon the stone as I walked to and fro, startled by the sound of the church bell when it struck the hour, for it was like a departed voice to me. My reflections at these times were always associated with the figure I was to make in life and the distinguished things I was to do. My echoing footsteps went to no other tune, but were as constant to that as if I had come home to build my castles in the air at a living mother's side. So here, right, it's important that we are in a gravestone, in a cemetery, as we have these ideas of memory, because in a lot of ways, memory is a resurrection of the dead, a sort of necromancy, which also in some ways is what reading is like. And so that's why we kind of dwell for a moment on that actual grave. And notice how we have that tense shift. I had looked out. We go to the perfect, the pluperfect at that point. Had looked out, like we're in the, Dickens is first giving us a memory, Copperfield is giving us a memory of when he was younger, and then that Copperfield gives us a memory of when he was younger. So we're giving us some nesting dolls of memory here. And we also shift to kind of the present, had ever since, kept neat. So now we're into the present. And then we have this bit of the hope of the future, the figure I was to make in life, the distinguished things I was to do, right? And it's weird, we have a temporal folding here because we have older Copperfield reflecting on that success, but we also have that middle-aged kind of 17-year-old Copperfield making hopes for the future. So memory is not just something that only looks backward. It also has, in a really interesting way, the power to affect and reflect upon the future. So briefly, we run into an odd parallel for Mr. Dick. The garden had run wild and half the windows of the house were shut up. It was occupied, but only by a poor lunatic gentleman and the people who took care of him. He was always sitting at my little window, looking out into the churchyard, and I wondered whether his rambling thoughts ever went upon any of the fancies that used to occupy mine on the rosy mornings when I peeped out of that same little window in my nightclothes and saw the sheep quietly feeding in the light of the rising sun. So here we have two doubles. One is the double of Mr. Dick, whom we first saw also looking at a window, but whose quite animated face was served as rather a more energetic introduction to a character than this one, whom we learn is poor and lunatic. Similarly, he is also the double of David himself, because he's occupying that same little window. And so here, this unnamed gentleman actually does quite a bit of work for thinking through parallels of the characters with whom we are spending time, right? In another person's narrative, this poor lunatic gentleman is a main character. When David sits down, so right, what's happening in this chapter is everybody going to Yarmouth, David and Steerforth. And David comes upon Steerforth, and Steerforth is a fire starer, meaning he looks into the fire and he's dejected. My dear Steerforth, what is the matter? I wish with all my soul I had been better guided, he exclaimed. I wish with all my soul I could guide myself better. There was a passionate dejection in his manner that quite amazed me. He was more unlike himself than I could have supposed possible. So here, right, we know something momentous is happening because Steerforth, whose very name says steers straight forward, is saying, I wish I had been guided and I wish I could guide myself better. There seems to be something else steering Steerforth at this moment. And so he buys a boat. I don't know that, he returned. I have taken a fancy to the place at all events, so walking me briskly on, I have bought a boat that was for sale, a clipper, Mr. Peggotty says, and so she is. And Mr. Peggotty will be the master of her in my absence. Now I understand you, Steerforth, said I, exultingly. You pretend to have bought it for yourself, but you have really done so to confer a benefit on him. I might have known as much at first, knowing you, my dear, kind Steerforth. How can I tell you what I think of your generosity? Tush, he said, turning red. The less said, the better. Didn't I know? Cried I. Didn't I say that there was not a joy or sorrow or any emotion of such honest hearts that was indifferent to you? Aye, he answered. You told me all that. There, let it rest. We have said enough. So here, right, we have David's naivete rise up, where he misinterprets, misconstrues the actions. Steerforth doesn't object completely, but he also doesn't give the wink. He kind of accepts David's misinterpretation of his actions, goes along with it, but is also not forthcoming in either support or decrying the falsity. So we have here this idea of David as a bad interpreter, which is always an exciting place to be when your narrator is bad at understanding a situation. And we learn more about the boat. She must be newly rigged, said Steerforth, and I shall leave Littimer behind to see it done, that I may know she is quite complete. Oh, did I tell you that Littimer had come down? No. Oh, yes. Came down this morning with a letter from my mother. As our looks met, I observed that he was pale even to his lips, though he looked very steadily at me. I feared that some distance between him and his mother might have led to his being in the frame of mind in which I had found him at the solitary fireside. I hinted so. Oh, no, he said, shaking his head and giving a slight laugh. Nothing of the sort. Yes, he's coming down, that man of mine. The same as ever? Said I. The same as ever, said Steerforth. Distant, quiet as the North Pole. He shall see to the boat being fresh named. She's a stormy petrel now. What does Mr. Peggotty care for stormy petrels? I'll have her christened again. By what name? I asked. The little Emily. Oh, what a passage. Notice, there we pay off. We're using feminine pronouns to talk about the boat. She must be newly rigged. She is quite complete. We're naming her the little Emily. Steerforth is in many ways taking possession of this little Emily, making sure that it looks like and behaves like what he wants it to, all of which is very interesting, incredibly dehumanizing, and full of potentials for thinking about a rising middle class, the objectification of women, the idea of social mobility. Literally, we're renaming a boat. So I think everything about this is weird, uncomfortable, fascinating. But let's talk about this weird thing with polar exploration, calling Litimer this. And it's not actually the only reference we get, because later on, Miss Mowcher will also reference the North Pole. The same as ever, said Steerforth, distant and quiet as the North Pole. He shall see to the boat being fresh named. She's the Stormy Petrel now. What does Mr. Peggotty care for stormy petrels? A petrel is a bird, by the way. I'll have her christened again, right? Chapter 22. And then later on, well, said Mowcher said, smiting her small knees and rising. This is not business. Come, Steerforth, let's explore the polar regions and have it over. So Miss Mowcher, right, it's a joke because she is a little person and she's referring to the top of Steerforth's head. So, but the other thing that's getting activated, right, it's weird to have two references to the North Pole and polar regions, especially when we're comparing a servant to being distant and quiet as the North Pole, and then to having a little person be the polar explorer, and also a female polar explorer, because polar exploration absolutely overwhelmed the Victorian imagination. So it was polar exploration and the idea of the Northwest Passage for the Victorian, a place of the imagination, of the sublime, of fear and desolation, economic hope even. In a lot of ways, it was their moonshot, their Mars habitation. And some of this is summarized from 1845 with the loss of the Franklin expedition, which was a fellow who'd set out in two boats to find the Northwest Passage right through northern Canada, trying to get to the Pacific Ocean. And the ships were lost, and Dickens actually got really invested in this. He wrote a play later on with Wilkie Collins in 1856 called The Frozen Deep, which was, for any number of other reasons, an important turning point of his life. The image I have here is just my favorite image of a polar explorer. This is the Danishman Peter Freuchen and his wife Dagmar, and I'm just completely struck by the jacket, the hair, the beard, and then her dapper clothing next to him. If you think about Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein begins and ends in the Arctic region. The Arctic is just a place of fertile thought for the Victorian imagination. And these references, right, they would be picked up and they would carry weight. What we do with them is in lots of ways left to us, right? We're rethinking, we're supposed to find it comical to have that juxtaposition between a Miss Mowcher talking about polar exploration. And yet, the fact that we're supposed to find that ironic is a way of underscoring stereotypes of gender and disability in the 19th century. Similarly, with comparing a person like Litimer to that calmness, when in fact the North Pole and search for it is famous for massive destruction, loss, death, and the unknown. So other ways of rethinking the idea of respectability. All right, so we also get a lot of allusions throughout Dickens, but I wanted to address it here because we have two kind of, in relative close proximity, allusions to Macbeth. So in chapter 18 with the young butcher, the shade of a young butcher rises like the apparition of an armed head in Macbeth. And then, so that's older Copperfield making that, right? That's author Copperfield. His face was always full, and then in chapter 22, his face was always full of expression, but I never saw it express such a dark kind of earnestness as when he said these words with his glance bent on the fire. So much for that, he said, making as if he tossed something light into the air with his hand. Why, being gone, I am a man again, like Macbeth. And now for dinner, if I have not, Macbeth-like, broken up the feast with most admired disorder, Daisy. So here, Steerforth is comparing himself to Macbeth, a play that at this point, it's unlikely that Copperfield has an awareness of, but notice earlier, like his authorial persona, he can reference what Macbeth is. He learns it. Steerforth, though, carries that Shakespearean knowledge lightly. It's also a play deeply interested in the idea of guidance, right? Think of the role of the witches at the beginning, the ideas of prophecy. And so we saw Steerforth earlier say, I wish I had been better guided. It's also like to compare yourself to Macbeth is to compare yourself to the king, to the person that's going to cause damage, to the person that doesn't really think things all the way through. Also consider yourself somebody with a Lady Macbeth. but that's something else to consider. All right, so let's look at Miss Mowcher. This is probably the most significant character in terms of minor characters for this. Actually, that's not true. Mr. Dick is too. Like the novel is full of this. I felt some curiosity and excitement about this lady, especially as Steerforth burst into a fit of laughing when I referred to her, and positively refused to answer any questions of which I made her the subject. I remained, therefore, in a state of considerable expectation until the cloth had been removed some half an hour, and we were sitting over our decanter of wine before the fire, when the door opened, and Litimer, with his habitual serenity, quite undisturbed, announced, "Miss Mowcher." I looked at the doorway and saw nothing. I was still looking at the doorway, thinking that Miss Mowcher was a long while making her appearance, when, to my infinite astonishment, there came waddling round a sofa, which stood between me and it, a pursy dwarf of about 40 or 45, with a very large red head and face, a pair of roguish gray eyes, and such extremely little arms that to enable herself to lay a finger archly against her snub nose as she ogled Steerforth, she was obliged to meet the finger halfway and lay her nose against it. Her chin, which was what is called a double chin, was so fat that it entirely swallowed the strings of her bonnet, bow and all. Throat she had none, waist she had none, legs she had none worth mentioning. For though she was more than full size down to where her waist would have been, if she had had any, and though she terminated, as human beings generally do, in a pair of feet, she was so short that she stood at a common-sized chair, as at a table. Resting a bag she carried on the seat, this lady, dressed in an offhand, easy style, bringing her nose and her forefinger together with the difficulty I have described, standing with her head necessarily on one side, and with one of her sharp eyes shut up, making an uncommonly knowing face after ogling Steerforth for a few moments, broke into a torrent of words. And those words that she will use are full of the secrets of young men, of means. So here we have a number of stereotypes about people with dwarfism, little people, and Dickens's rather cruel play on this that's meant to be for comedic effect. What we see here is part of the history of comedy, the history of writing the other, the history of using people for humor when, and this is what's important, right? There's so little representation of people with disabilities in mainstream fiction that when these kind of descriptions survive, they tend to get treated as the norm. And Dickens gets called out for this because he actually based this description on his neighbor at the time, Jane Seymour Hill. And she and her lawyers sent him a series of letters. Here we have this particular one from December. If you had attacked me in the full time of health, wealth, and happiness, I think perhaps I could have borne it with patience. But now, widowed in all but my good name, you show up my personal deformities with insinuations that by the purest of my sex may be construed to the worst of purposes. All I know, you have drawn, all know you have drawn my portrait. I admit it, but the vulgar slang of language I deny. May your widow and children never meet with such blighting wit as you have poured on my miserably nervous head. Should your book be dramatized and I not protected, madness will be the result. I have suffered long and much from my personal deformities, but never before at the hands of a man so highly gifted as Charles Dickens, and hitherto considered as a Christian and friend to his fellow creatures. Now you have made my nights sleepless and my daily work tearful. Tell me, how have I deserved your anger? So here we have one of the very early powerful statements from a person below speaking to a person with power and saying, like, you are punching down and it hurts and it's not a good thing, and really calling Dickens out. So we'll keep all of this kind of boiling in the back of my mind in the back of our play. We also have, though, in addition, in chapter 22, still in chapter 22, the appearance of Martha. This is Ham coming and asking if David will talk to him. Why, you see, Master Davy, he rejoined in a hesitating manner. Emily, she's talking to someone in there. I should have thought, said I, smiling, that was the reason for your being in here too, Ham. Well, Master Davy, in a general way, such would be, he returned, but Look here, Master Davy, lowering his voice and speaking very gravely. It's a young woman, sir. A young woman that Emily knowed once and oughtn't to know no more. So what's going on here is Ham's reluctant to be with a woman whose reputation has been tarnished for being sexually active outside of marriage. This is the idea of a fallen woman. So this can manifest as prostitution, as people that leave their homes to live on the street, whether out of mental illness or addiction or choice. And it's when usually it means the fall, right, is a reference to Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden. Fallen here is also a socioeconomic phrase, fallen out of the middle class, out of the idea of bourgeois existence and traditional notions of continuity in society. So you are fallen off the path of what is socially acceptable. The girl, the same I had seen upon the sands, was near the fire. She was sitting on the ground with her head on one arm lying in a chair. I fancied from the disposition of her figure that Emily had but newly risen from the chair, and that the forlorn head might perhaps have been lying on her lap. I saw but little of the girl's face, over which her hair fell loose and scattered, as if she had been disordering it with her own hands. But I saw that she was young and of a fair complexion. Peggotty had been crying, so had little Emily. Not a word was spoken when we first went in, and the Dutch clock by the dresser seemed in the silence to tick twice as loud as usual. Emily spoke first. Martha wants, she said to Ham, to go to London. So here we get this description really offsetting how alone Martha is. But the thing I love in the way that Dickens phrases Emily's intervention here is Martha wants. Then we hit our suspended quotation before we say to go to London, right? We have a woman who has desires, right? She is a human being. And that means taking agency of a certain point for one's actions. And Martha's like, I want to go to London because I want to be able to disappear, because where I'm from, everybody knows what's happened to me. Of course, we don't learn that, right? So it's also left to the reader's imaginations to supply all of these things that happened. A few things that we get here, the repetition constantly of the girl and the girl. But we also learn young and fair complexion, hair loose and scattered. Some of these are visual iconography of a fallen woman. So Dickens at this time is deeply invested in the care of women such as this. So in 1847, he opened the doors to Urania Cottage, which they called the home, funded by the philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts. And essentially, it was for fallen women to learn skills, often sewing, cooking, reading, writing, and basic arithmetic before being emigrated. That is, they had to move to Australia or Canada once they were seen to be rescued from the street. It was voluntary, people had to apply. Dickens was extremely involved at every level of the place. If you're interested in reading more about this, there's a website that's listed on the page here. Also, chapter 14 of Claire Tomalin's biography has some words on it. The most extended discussion, though, is in Hartley's Charles Dickens in the House of Fallen Women, where she has just done extraordinary archival work to trace some of the families of these people. In this house, there was room for 13 women and a matron and an assistant. Lots of stories surround them. Some people that entered, went through, and it was fine. Others that entered and continued to pursue their addictions, or that just left. Dickens ended his involvement in 1858 for a number of reasons. One of which has to do with a person that he met while producing The Frozen Deep. But that will be a story we will tell later. All right, so a little bit more do a fun switch. Chapter 24, Copperfield gets drunk. I have another video that where I talk about this scene with two other colleagues at great length, but I just want to note one small thing here. I went on by passing the wine faster and faster yet, and continually starting up with a corkscrew to open more wine, long before any was needed. I proposed Steerforth's health. I said he was my dearest friend, the protector of my boyhood, and the companion of my pride. I said I was delighted to propose his health. I said I owed him more obligations than I could ever repair, and held him to a higher admiration than I could ever express. I finished by saying, I'll give you Steerforth. Oh, God bless him. Hurrah. We gave him 3 times 3, and another, and a good one to finish it. I broke my glass and going around the table to shake hands with him, and I said in 2 words, Steerforth, you're the guiding star of my existence. And so we have this fantastic run-on word, you're the guiding star of my existence, and we have in it a break because he hiccups. His drunken hiccup. It's a moment of great delight, of extremely interesting writing for verisimilitude. How do you write drunkenness? And Dickens is essentially creating a language for this and a visual for it. It's full of a completely different kind of energy. There's like, it's this youthful, drunken state, right? It's the first time that David has really changed his existence in this way, seeing the world in a new place. And he's traumatized with just a massive hangover because of how he ran into Agnes at the theater that same night. That's a scene that has added pathos because Agnes's father is, of course, an alcoholic. All right, a brief note on a couple of references to empire that we get here. Back in chapter 22, when he's going back around Blunderstone, our old neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Draper, were going to South America, and the rain had made its way through the roof of their nearly empty house and stained the outer walls. Mr. Chillip was married again to a tall, raw-boned, high-nosed wife, and they had a wheezing little baby with a heavy head and couldn't hold up, 2 weak staring eyes, with which it seemed to be always wondering why it had ever been born. So here we have this interesting phrase of people leaving Britain and Britain becoming quite weak. So the house itself is now falling down. We then learn that Mr. Chillip marries this person, and then the new generation, the baby seems weak as well. So is this a comment on emigration leading to a weakness in British Constitution? Perhaps. Then in chapter 23, Litimer touched his hat in acknowledgement of my good opinion, and I felt about 8 years old. He touched it once more, wishing us a good journey, and we left him standing on the pavement, as respectable a mystery as any pyramid in Egypt. So in the first place, what we have here is Britain being in South America is Guyana. So it's a thing worth looking further into in terms of that intervention, but that's the location that we're going to be, that they're thinking about there in terms of emigrating to South America. And Egypt is just general Victorian Egyptomania. You have here an image from the end of the 19th century of British tourists in Egypt taking in the sights. At the end of Great Expectations, right, where Pip ends up going, he's going to be a kind of middle-class factotum in bureaucracy in Egypt. Egypt occupies an enormous part of the British imagination. Ongoing excavations are taking place there. Resource extraction is taking place there. Access to the Suez Canal is going to be important. So just a lot of different things mark Britain's intervention in North Africa being in Egypt specifically. All right, so let's start wrapping this up with some discussions here of the illustrations. So Miss Mowcher, what we have here is she's on the table, and notice Steerforth. Steerforth's hair is curled, and he's kind of side-eyeing David. David's hair is lank and straight. So Steerforth exudes sexuality, right? Notice his legs are separated. He has his pelvis pointed outward at the reader, kind of. David is turned inward away from us. David's straight back like that. Steerforth is more at an incline. Notice Mowcher is kind of looking at him as well. Over here, this illustration is hard to make out, but it is of Gulliver's Travels, and it's Gulliver with the giants dancing on a table. In the back, we have a shipwreck, and here we have what seems to be Mephistopheles looking on while Faust and Gretchen get together, right? Part of that deal that takes place in that play. So a lot of different things are coming together here, all of which surround Mowcher, right? So she is prominently in the middle of this tableau. Now, the images each give us kind of alternatives of fate. And then we also have the second illustration, which is of Martha. So we've already seen a woman kind of down on her knees in front of a chair before, right at the end of the last installment. That's where we saw Annie Strong with Dr. Strong, but here, of course, we don't have a male figure. Notice we see Annie's neck, right? So she's also showing that little bit of skin there. Her hair is kind of paralleled in some ways to Emily's hair. Ham looks down, Strong, central, pitying. David's almost hidden in the back here. Peggotty has her head bowed, hair covered. So Martha's hat is down to the side, her purse is to the side. And then in the background, what we have here is an image of the prostitute anointing Christ's feet. So a little biblical passage there. And in the back, over the door, we have Eve and the snake. Eve and the snake. So a lot of different biblical allusions that we're kind of supposed to see. And this question that's set up around ideas of forgiveness. David being behind and in shadow is a quite interesting position. This chair being unoccupied as well, this idea of almost absence that we have. And so with that, we end installment 8 and we're going on to 9 and 10 as things are really starting to take off